Welcome everybody to this London Futurists Zoom meeting where we're making another kind of experiment. This is an experiment in collaborative discussion using Zoom. We are going to be discussing a particular topic which is in the news a lot recently, thinking about the implications in the short term, but also thinking about the implications in the longer term too. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to a number of people who are going to, in various ways, help set the scene for this discussion. Here's a few words from myself, which is the two deep questions of futurism are always which scenarios are possible, which scenarios make sense, technically and credibly, and then what scenarios are desirable. Not just what could we do, but what should we do. So when we're discussing mobile apps, we have to avoid falling for wishful thinking, avoid falling for hype. And when we're thinking about what do we want from our mobile apps, we also have to think ahead to possible undesired consequences, which we'd better foresee sooner rather than later. In terms of what the apps could do, I think it's quite clear they could help warn us about risks of infection, not in a way that's absolutely guaranteed for reasons we'll be discussing, but they can give us some probabilistic likelihood that we may have been close to somebody who might be infectious, whether we've been close to them as an individual, or perhaps we have been close to somewhere which is subsequently identified as being a hotspot for infection. This isn't going to remove the manual tracing of where infectious people have been. Manual tracing has been part of every epidemic response, pandemic response since at least the Spanish flu. It's a process that involves a lot of time-consuming contacting people, asking them questions, but it may well be that with the help of information recorded by mobile phones, this will make the process a bit smoother. There are some other things we might hope that the apps may do. It might help to monitor body temperature and in other ways provide an indication of who might be infected. And it could also help to highlight breaches in quarantine. Some countries have already made it the rule that, for example, if you visit that country from outside, you need to quarantine yourself. And as a proof of quarantine, you need to carry an app and prove that you're carrying the app. And there may be other ways in which the apps could be used to prevent people with infection spreading that intentionally or unintentionally, carelessly. In terms of what we want the mobile apps to do and not to do, we don't want to be lulled into a sense of technological solutionism, thinking, well, we've got the app, therefore we can relax some of the other measures. It's a bit like some people are opposed to just telling everybody to wear masks because the masks might give people a false sense of reassurance and they might actually lead some people to get too close to each other and still end up touching their faces and getting infected. So we don't want people to be misled by a hype about what the apps can do. There are various practical ways in which apps could go wrong if they drain batteries and otherwise prevent the apps from working. Or they might interfere with each other. One question we'll be discussing is coexistence, possibly, of different types of contact tracing apps. If Britain decides to go down the route of its own NHSX app, but people want to travel to Europe and therefore they need to also install the apps used by other countries in Europe, will the apps coexist or not? It's not at all clear, especially if both of them are talking to Bluetooth on a frequent basis. Then there's the bigger concerns about leaking of personal data. We can all see that in a certain sense, it's good for data to be collected and pooled and more wisdom and insight can come from that. But there are fears about where we have been or who we've met being somehow exploited by big tech or by big government. Some people say that some of these large companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, already know far too much about us. We shouldn't give them any more. Some people say that the information won't just be kept for short-term medical purposes. They are afraid that once we share this information, it might be used by other parts of government. The final thing I'll say in my own warm-up is there are very positive things that, in principle, the apps, we want them to help us with. We do want and value people being healthy, and we do value, as soon as possible, reopening the, let's say, the productive and good parts of the economy. So these are the positive sides of what we would want apps to do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. And in a minute, I'm going to ask some panelists to also set the scene. A few other words on how this system will work. There's a slight chance I may freeze, and hopefully I'll come back within a few seconds. Please continue the discussion without me. There's an even smaller chance the whole Zoom meeting might fail. Hopefully not. But if that does, we'll reconvene on another link. I'll send that out via email to the email address you used when you registered. Well, at this stage, I'd like to invite Eva Pascoe, who has been studying tracking apps for probably longer than almost anyone else. In terms of her work, which she may explain, she is the chair of Cyberthalon, and I think she'll say a few words about that too. So over to you, Eva.
Thank you, David. Let me just... Right, so I'm very interested in this current development. I've been involved in footfall tracking for about 10 years now, mainly from the point of view of trying to rescue, help, and transition high street. So we started working with retailers probably 2011, looking at developments of technology which would help us to make precision in estimation where people are, where they gather, how they shop, and just help to adjust the retail proposition. So slowly we started working through a number of different organizations, but mainly with large retailers, thinking that it would be very easy because obviously with iPhones being more and more popular, exploding in fact in about 2010, we can just count everybody, report to the retailers and be done. Well, unfortunately, it turned out to be very hard or almost impossible. With increased direction of travel by Apple, where Apple decided that they were on the side of privacy, and rightly so started closing up the access to location of mobile phones to anybody who wanted to find out where people were. So the app developers were working with pretty much both hands tied behind their hands. Whether for good reason or bad reason, you just couldn't get the data. And some of the data was really coming up quite funny. So we couldn't figure out why on earth we had large gatherings of people, 500, 600 people, in the middle of the night on some of the smaller high streets, until we figure out actually that they were the phones in Carphone warehouse making themselves known to the research and pretending to be people. A lot of twists and turns, but we have never managed to work it out. And despite significant funding, because it's a footfall, even anonymous footfall is something that every retailer wants to know, it has never really came to fruition. So I was quite intrigued when the current app started being talked about, and thinking of all the reasons why the previous footfall tracking for retail has never really worked. So I just wanted to show you a few things in the context of the current thinking, based on assumption that somehow the Asian communities have figured it out before. So there's obviously the examples being talked about from Korea and from Singapore, that they were successful in managing COVID there. But when we started looking at it a bit closer, it really wasn't the case. It was only a small proportion of quite wide approach. And the acceptance in Singapore was really very small. It was only about 13%. Korea, not much bigger, for a number of reasons, which we will talk about in a minute. But it just reminded me that, you know, from my practical retail perspective, getting people to download an app, even if it's Tinder, it's not really easy job. So we have made a massive assumption about all these downloading facilities that people have. And I came across this stat from Statista, our very own Statista, that is showing that, yes, obviously the young people are, hooked up to their phones at the hip, and that will not change. But as the age progresses, by the age of about 55 to 64, only about 55% of people actually have smartphone. A lot of people are still on the previous versions and not necessarily missing them because they use them for calls. And when you go further, the number of people of this subset that do carry smartphones but are keen to download apps are even smaller. So it goes from about 83% for teens, but for boomer generations, only 39%. And obviously this is American data. So in UK, you can safely divide it into half because we're also a little bit less keen on downloading things on our phones. So the acceptance was one problem. The second problem we struggled with is using cell towers. So triangulation of cell towers is all very exciting, but it gives you really not good accuracy for any of precise contact tracing. So 3/4 square mile is still a heck of a local distance. If you start using that, you will have masses and masses of positive or false positives. So we started looking at other solutions for ourselves, for the retail. The other problems that I didn't mention were problems with battery, but I'm hearing that the current NHS X team has solved the battery issue. We struggle with it because if you have Bluetooth pinging, it unfortunately consumes quite a lot of energy. And if you get through half of the day with it on, you're doing well. So obviously that raised a number of questions because you want to know where people are in the evening, because in the day, they're usually in one space. It's the evening when we start moving around and meeting people. I think it was a story this morning about one chap from South Korea that single-handedly managed to meet 1,500 people in about 4 days by going to 4 nightclubs. So it doesn't mean that he infected them, but it means that there's a lot of people you'll be meeting in the evening. So having a bit more precision would be helpful. So what we started looking is not national apps and not solutions, one for everyone, but solutions for individual businesses. So one of them is a company called MicroShare that I came across a while ago, which is based on a wristband. And I was interested to see that South Koreans have gone back to that, because what happened in Korea, I haven't even mentioned privacy. We'll go to it later with other people, but South Koreans decided that the risk of download is so high that they either do download to pretend they do and then park their phone at home, or give it to someone else in the family who didn't go outside the allocated area. So now the South Koreans are going back to the wristbands because they think that they are much more controllable. Obviously, I think South Koreans will take a week to work out how to duck and dive around the wristbands. What I'm saying is, like, even in highly surveyed and highly disciplined dictatorial communities, this whole business of downloading anything and wearing what needs to be worn is highly questionable. However, within the work environment, we probably will be able to do it if, let's say, John Lewis staff will want to show to the customers that they are monitored and self-monitoring. I can also imagine some of the banks who inevitably will drag people back to Canary Wharf, that they will want something a little bit more robust and resilient than just a phone. So in my mind, we're probably going away from the phones and more to other devices. And also something that we were working for warehouses. So warehouses luckily are large and they can manage social distancing. But what we've noticed, there are some areas where it's harder than others. So this is a tracking network from a company called Loxis, which is now used for social distancing monitoring, but also for introducing, prioritizing for clean spots. So if you have clean spots that need harder approach, the heat map will show it. It will also trace contact if anybody got infected. So this can be implemented within retail, within warehouse, within specific building. I'm sort of waiting for WeWorks to start doing that, because they're in such a deep hole at the moment that they will need to show that they're whiter than white, cleaner than the Pope, before anybody goes to the environment. So I'm thinking they probably will start looking at beacon-based network. So I think that's kind of my issues. The privacy, there are other people who will talk about it, but I'm thinking there is probably a shift from one size fits all and national app solution for everybody into much more granular, much more specific, and much more age-friendly approaches. So in my view, the app will be a part of a much bigger landscape, possibly a solution, but only in a tiny way.
Many thanks, Eva. I mean, a couple of quick questions for me on that. In terms of how many people would need to be using the app for it to be useful. Wendy Grossman offers some figures from Ofcom. 22% of UK adults have no smartphone. When you go up to older adults, half don't. But even if only maybe a quarter of the population are carrying the app, might it still be some use for that? And might there also be a wave of new adoption if people say, well, now's the time to change my phone or get the system, because after all, life and death, it might be a matter of life and death.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I wasn't trying to be defeatist, not at all, but I think I would approach it in a different way. Now, when I look at the situation at the moment, it reminds me about Minitel. So those of you who remember Minitel.
In France.
Yep. Yeah, in France, which was a lovely little solution, but it basically was something very French. And it started very quickly hitting against internet. And the French were so keen to be French that they thought about it and defended to the last minute. And I think only really sunsetted it in 2012. But watching it from kind of parallel, because obviously we started Siberia, so we were still seeing quite a bit of Minitel in France when we took cyber cafes to Centre Pompidou in the late 90s. I was just amazed how certain countries always think that they're bigger than they should be. And I think UK, unfortunately, is in the same position. You know, our thinking about the app is very parochial. The solution that UK is going for, following only kind of UK myopic suburban approach, versus going with Apple and Google, which will be international, interchangeable, interoperable. We're going to the slightly wrong end. But the worst thing was to test it in Isle of Wight. And the same happened with Minitel. When they started testing Minitel, they put it in Saint-Malo in Brittany, where the average age is about 65. Everybody's retired, and everybody said, no, we don't want it. Why would we need it for? And it wasn't until they put it in the nearby university city where the kids started playing with it, and they showed the parents and grandparents how to do it. So the first thing I would do is to, whatever app you've got to test, plonk it in Shoreditch or Bristol or Bath or Brighton, you know, one of 3 Bs, where we always test our apps. I cannot fathom why would anybody want to go to Isle of Wight, because you will just not get any early adoption there. And we know we need early adopters. You know, I do apps for a living, and it's hard work. You need to get it to early adopters, make it amazing, preferably to put, you know, Tinder on it, and then may download it. So something which is not high value and tested in a very low adoption area, it's quite weird.
Well, we might hear from somebody from the Isle of Wight later today. I don't know. But I would like to turn now to Dean Bubley, who may have views on British app versus the rest of the world, or he has other insight from his long career as a wireless industry analyst. Dean.
Thanks, David. So first off, yeah, I'm a wireless industry analyst, and I don't just, well, to be honest, I don't spend as much time looking at apps and devices as I do about networks. And so, you know, part of the lens I'm looking at when I hear about Bluetooth track and trace is, first off, you know, will you cause interference on that particular part of the spectrum if you have a high density of users? But before I go into the sort of get into the technical weeds, the question that I have in my mind is, what is the app supposed to be for, whether it's a centralized or decentralized? And yeah, I suppose I can see 3 different possible scenarios here. The first is that the app is there primarily for individuals to inform you of a risk that you have been infected, and therefore, or you may be in proximity to someone else who is infected. The second possibility is it's there for the benefit of the government, either so that they can understand locationally where hotspots are for the virus, whether it's a restaurant or a bar or public transport or another context, or perhaps to give them just general snapshot data and trends over time, help them better estimate R0, perhaps by location or by demographic type. So that's the second one, is the government. And the third one is the app is there perhaps to fit into a much broader context of tracking and tracing and identifying people who have got COVID-19, who may or may not pass it on, and then perhaps also to manage quarantine as well. The question I have in my mind at the moment is the first one. It's about, if it's supposed to be about telling you about your own risk, and have you met someone or been in close proximity to someone who's infected. And the problem I see there is that we know that infection can be passed on person to person, but also we can pick up viruses from surfaces. And the app is of absolutely no use. Even if it works perfectly, it can't tell you if you have been touching a surface where someone an hour before perhaps was touching. So at the very least, it can only ever be part of the solution. At a personal level. So I think that whilst, then you can go into the discussion about whether the app should be centralized or decentralized. There's pros and cons on both. And it's interesting that the UK isn't alone. I think the French, the Indians, Australians, and a few others have gone for the centralized approach, which perhaps gives access to location as well as proximity. But at the risk of perhaps of privacy and perhaps reluctance for people to download it. So there's a bunch of trade-offs here that I think perhaps we can explore in the conversation. If I look at what's been going on in South Korea, the actual main approach to tracking and tracing is more around the manual side of this. Perhaps some aspects can be automated, but it's less about the app and more about credit cards, CCTV, essentially using a whole bunch of other data sources. And then I think it's Singapore that's done this, or possibly Korea as well, where they've alerted people and said, we think we have someone you may have been in the same context as, and by context, I mean, that could be a location, it could be in proximity to the person, and then check on the app to see if you were on this bus or that location at this time. I don't think they're going quite as far as saying, do you recognize this person? But I guess that's an end point of it. And so again, it comes back to the trade-offs. How much of our privacy are we willing to give up, either to stop ourselves being infected, or if we are infected, to stop other people being infected? The other question I have is this idea of the international interoperability. My understanding is that Google and Apple are standardizing APIs, which will then be used by additional apps written on top of the operating system. And so then it's not obvious to me that countries app A is going to interoperate with countries app B, even if they both share the same underlying Google and Apple APIs. You can probably do it, but it's not obvious how that works operationally in terms of alerting, for example. I haven't seen the details of what Apple and Google are doing on. So I suspect that we're probably going to have, whatever happens, this is going to be, we're currently all running a live beta. And there's going to be lots of different beta tests in different parts of the world, which will progressively iterate over the next 3, 6, 12, 18 months. So whatever we start with this week is almost certainly not going to be what we end up with in a year's time, or even when we all start traveling again. So I'll leave it there and turn it back.
So as part of being in a live beta, it's still our responsibility to think and ask questions and to shape. And I like your emphasis on understanding the requirements. And so much of my life in the technology industry, we saw examples of people being too excited by technology solutions and not thinking hard enough about the requirements that these solutions might address. So are we really going to highlight the location angle? Because the Google and Apple solution doesn't provide location data. It only tells you that you have been close to somebody that has subsequently identified as being infectious. And NHS have said, hang on, it would be useful for them to know the location data too. And I have some sympathy with that, but it's worth understanding the requirement up front.
And I think that location over time will get more and more granular. For example, GPS location is very imprecise and doesn't work indoors. Well, it's not as imprecise as some of the cell data, but it's usually got 20, 30 meter inaccuracy for GPS. And indoor, when you're at and not in line of sight of satellites, it's pretty useless. And so in theory, you could even then be within 2 meters of someone, but there's a wall between you or a ceiling. In which case you technically haven't got to worry about it. So in the long term, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, hopefully we'll get better indoor positioning technology. Some of that comes with 5G, although there's a bunch of other questions there about how 5G works indoors. But there's a bunch of others that are either inertial-based or beacon-based indoor positioning technologies. Yeah, in theory, the ideal thing would be is if you could integrate it with the blueprints of the building you're in, so you know if there's a wall or a partition or a floor and ceiling between you and someone else, even if you're within a 2 meter sphere. But I think that's going to have to wait a while.
Just before we turn to Bruce Lloyd, Eva, what about this indoor location technology? People have been talking about it for 10 years or so. Is it a possibility that it'll be accelerated, or do you expect we'll still be waiting for it in 10 years more time?
No, I think you will see very, very rapid acceleration, as we see massively compressed innovation on working from home. I was just looking at the figures from Zoom, and they went from 10 million sessions per day to 300 million sessions per day during COVID. So we can see that humans can be made to jump hoops quickly when they have to. And I think exactly the same will happen with the indoor positioning. It will have to, because when you think about it, all our pensions are stuck in some format of commercial property. And that commercial property, to my look this morning, looks empty because nobody's going to go back. If people like JP Morgan are not going to go back, Google said they're not going to go back for another 18 months. I can't see anybody going back. So these poor people who are running offices, they will have to spend big money on making sure that they can show us that we're safe. And the only one way to do it is to have proper indoor positioning, to know where everybody has been within the office and make sure that they can convince us that it's okay to go to the office at least once a week. Otherwise, nobody's gonna go. So I think the investment is going to come from the property people. We've been talking about prop tech for a while, but now it's a real tech. It will absolutely have to come to the fore to rescue the office, which, might not even be rescuable, but warehouses will need indoor positioning and large stores will need indoor positioning. So those two will spend good money on it.
I'd follow up. I had a call this week with one of the leading providers of smart building technology and had a good conversation about what that might need. And it depends on whether it's a warehouse or retail is very different from offices, and whether it's new build or refurbed. I mean, can you imagine that some of the challenges are going to be really intractable? For example, how do you manage social distancing in elevators in a skyscraper? Do you have to book your slot in the elevator in the morning for going to work and you arrive at 9:05 because you can only get 3 people in your 27-person elevator, for example?
Sounds like it might be easier to develop a vaccine or other healthcare solution, but we don't know how long it's going to take, so we need to pursue different ideas in parallel. Let me bring in Bruce Lloyd at this stage. Bruce is Emeritus Professor from London South Bank University. Bruce, you've got high views on location and other topics. What would you like to share with the meeting?
Well, I think it's been extremely interesting to hear the challenges and problems that Eva and Dean have outlined. And the approach that I have been arguing for, so far very unsuccessfully, is to take a slightly different approach to the underlying problem. And of course, we're not going to have any perfect solutions, and there are always going to be issues. But the first step seems to me to be the identification of hotspots. And one of the very simple approaches to this would be to make sure that everyone that is, first of all, going into hospital or having a serious problem is interviewed over their recent areas of that they've moved around in, so that you're getting a focus not so much on the people but on the places. Now, if you got that information from a large number of people, and we've got the breakdown by boroughs in Camden, for example, and in London, but we haven't got the breakdown as to where the hotspots are. Now, that should be relatively easily produced, and it could be, that information could be progressively superimposed upon an app or a variation of a Google map, so that an individual who was going out jogging or going out shopping would be able to identify very easily where the hotspots were. If they wanted to go to a hotspot, they were taking the risk that they ought to get tested and they might have special issues, or alternatively, they might want to take an alternative route or an alternative place to go, which wasn't a hotspot. Now, I think that if you can find a way of controlling the hotspots to start with relatively easily, without all these other issues, that is something that, as far as I know, isn't getting done and could be done very easily. And I think that we ought to make sure that that approach is, maybe there are flaws in it and it's not quite as easy as it's obviously not all that easy. You're going to have some technology that puts the information into a Google map, but it ought to be fairly easy to do, and you wouldn't have all the other issues about elderly people taking up apps, security, privacy issues, because you're focusing on places where there are hotspots, and from those hotspots, you could progressively move out into other areas and notice where the infections were moving to, or exactly what was happening. And by getting a grip of the whole situation from that direction, I think you'd get the R number down very much faster than you would even if you got these other systems up and operating, which I think, especially after, I was very skeptical of them before, but I'm even more skeptical that they would actually produce the results we want. And there are other ways of getting 90% or more of the answer at very, very little cost and investment. But it's not so technologically exciting, and it's not so, it's much more top-down than having a bottom-up exercise, which is the sort of thing that I think ought to be given the priority that it deserves. Did you get that?
I froze at the end there. I was going to ask you about the Zoe app, the ZOE app, which I fill in every day. It comes from, I think, Imperial College. It collects lots of information about which regions of the UK have more infections than others. Are you familiar with it, Bruce?
No, I'm not. But
no,
does it then give you a map as to where these infections are taking place? Because, of course, at the moment, I would say well over 50% are in care homes or in hospitals.
So, I mean, here's a bit of a view. It doesn't break down into care homes and hospitals, at least on this. It seems to be highlighting Redbridge as an area in which there is a little bit of a higher density.
Well, we've got the league tables for London boroughs.
Right, but that's not enough. You're looking for a more fine-grained.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any comments, Eva or Dean, before we open it up to wider discussion?
First one that strikes me is it's quite difficult to work out a specific location of where an infection was passed on without essentially questioning an individual. And the other thing is that sometimes the hotspots are movable, i.e. a bus, for example. So if you actually pick it up on a bus or on a tube where it's underground, it's really difficult to map locate that, or a group in a park or something like that. So it sounds good, but maybe you end up with a bus route or something. But there's some practical challenges.
Just one point on that. I would certainly expect people to be interviewed, but the information would then be anonymous, because you're not really interested in the people who had it. You're interested in where the infection might be taking place.
Before we move into breakout rooms and pursue individual parts of this discussion more, there were quite a few interesting lines of discussion on chat. Doug Pipchick, you mentioned a system that you have in your office. I wonder if you could say something about that, if you're still here and if you've got the microphone. Doug.
Yep. So, I mean, we operate across like 100 countries, and we needed a way to try and control our business. So basically we went fairly primitive. We went with QR codes and site entry, basically created what we call an HSE passport for that basically tracks individual information.
This is in the last month or so. Has it been put in place?
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, right.
So, and it took 3 weeks to develop. So,
and how does the passport or the system work?
Basically, it's an internal database, and basically everybody has a QR code, and to get into any site, you have to submit your QR code. So it's basically like a passport from site to site.
And does this seem to be working and meeting requirements? Are employees happy with it?
Yeah, so far, yeah. I mean, everybody's looking for a way to protect themselves, right? So I mean, that's what we're using internally as a company. So, but I mean, that's a captive audience as compared to the general public, but it allows our people to continue working.
Wendy Grossman, you say this looks very like the China apps Alipay health code. Do you want to comment on that? Wendy?
Yeah, sure. China has an app that started in one city and is now in, I think, at least 200 cities. And it's not just an app, it's backed up by policing and so forth. But basically, the app knows a lot of things about you because China has, giant databases that are all connected. And so it uses everything it knows about you to create a risk score, which it translates into a red, yellow, or green code. And then, they have police stationed at, at the entrances to transit stations and various areas of the cities and public, large workplaces. And you have to show the code and I think go through a temperature screening as well. So it has, when it was first discovered by the West, something like 6 or 8 weeks ago, people were just horrified by, because people are, people who don't have a green code, there's large parts of their own city that they can't access. And so it is a very restrictive thing. But I mean, the thing about all these apps is that there's a lot, it isn't just the app itself, it's how it's implemented. I don't think we're going to have the same level of policing that China would have, or that people would accept it. So it really, I think they have to do a lot of work to gain trust. The other thing I really wanted to say, I wanted to agree with, I didn't get his name, who was talking about looking for hotspots. I don't understand why as soon as they saw nursing homes, they didn't start to think about other confined spaces where people work or live very closely together. I don't understand why, having discovered that meatpacking plants are this disaster in the US, why aren't we looking for those other, you know, sort of workplaces and spaces where people are packed together for long periods of time? Because that's obviously a vector.
And anybody know why we're not? Anybody know the answer to that? Why hasn't that been made a priority?
I have no idea.
Right.
We don't hear about it. Maybe it is, but we don't hear about it.
So anybody want to comment more on the trust issue, which I think has been raised by several people in chat, including Annette, which is that if we were able and willing to trust our government that they wouldn't misuse the data, we'd be more readily relaxed with this data being picked up. Some countries seem to have more of a trust for their government because they feel, well, if the government does a bad thing, we can get rid of them. And others, maybe they don't think about it too much. After all, we seem to implicitly trust the network operators when we use our phones. The network operator knows where we are at all times. Google knows a heck of a lot about where I go. When I click on my Google timeline every month or so, it has a shocking amount of data about where I visited, and there are other monitoring services. And although I'm not entirely comfortable with everything that Google does, I sort of seem to trust it to that extent. So anybody else want to comment on that trust issue? And Eva, you think we need a digital bill of rights?
Yes, that's something that we've been working on with Cyber Salon way back from probably about 15 years ago, because I could see that with the introduction of cookies, third-party cookies, the digital scene started looking rather unpleasant and smell even worse. But unfortunately, the governance of internet has fell for advertisers' money, and we are in a situation where, yeah, it all goes back to the third-party cookies in a way. But I think in UK is quite specific. I can see that Cambridge Analytica debacle being so recent, and Vote Leave handling the data, and basically Vote Leave team banking number 10, it just does not adapt to anybody that we should be handing any more data to that lot. So I would expect the government being incredibly naive. And, you know, as much as I love NHSX, you know, certain things you cannot explain to a virgin, whether with text or pictures. If you haven't been through data privacy drama and you haven't launched an app yourself, which none of this team have, you just have no idea what you're doing. So it's naive to expect that anybody in UK will hand off the data to this particular government. It's just absurd.
It's a case of once bitten, twice shy. It's no longer a rational decision. It might even make rational sense to hand over the data, but somehow we are emotionally aroused and especially fearful.
I have a suspicion that it's a fairly small percentage of people who have that view and that, well, either the knowledge or the knowledge and that opinion of the knowledge. So I think it's probably overrepresented among people on this call, for example, versus if you did a survey of overall UK population, particularly those who are...
That must have been the case before Cambridge Analytica, because I work on privacy a very long time. And, you know, I'm Polish. I've seen when privacy goes wrong, what happens. So I always had my own personal beef in that, because I know what it can go wrong. But since Cambridge Analytica, every survey we've done, that whole privacy issue bubbled right to the very top. And we absolutely are on mainstream need for Bill of Digital Rights. You are right, 5 years ago, now it's very different. It became mainstream issue.
I think it was roughly at the same time as Edward Snowden as well. So I suspect that if I remember correctly, there was a whole set of privacy issues around the same time. And that started when Facebook more generally came into the frame. So I think around 2017, 2018, suddenly, you know, the sort of privacy klaxon started, you know, buzzing for a lot of people with different triggers.
Do you think that it would be different if the government would put a sunset clause in and they would commit to definitely removing the data after, say, 6 months, or the whole app would be shut down after 18 months or so?
Better than nothing.
Better than nothing. One last point I'd like to touch on before we break into smaller discussions is, what about the battery issue? There was a bit of discussion earlier. Eva, you said you thought that there was a word from NHS that they're no longer worried about the battery implications of polling Bluetooth and regularly. I'd heard that the problem is that if the app is in background, it doesn't work, especially on iOS. So it has to be brought to the foreground, and that's a usability issue as well.
It is, but I think what they are trying to use is, you know, it's like Tile, that app that looks for your keys. I think there is a kind of like a bit of a gray area that they managed to explore. So I haven't seen the detail. I was going to look at the GitHub later today, but it sounds that it's solvable. So that's one less, that could be one less thing to worry about. But, you know, that's one of the relatively small things to worry about. I think somebody raised on the chat the issue, would we feel safer and better if it was developed on the app and Google platform? And I think I personally would feel better, but also, you know, app environment, app development is such a high dependency situation. You know, we haven't had in UK our own mobile phone manufacturer for about 20 years since Motorola closed down. So we are absolutely guests on Apple, Google platform anyway. So the whole idea of trying to do something by ourselves in our little suburban corner, it's very risky. And when you try to solve something in the, you know, life or death situation, you really don't want to pile any more risks on your tech stack. You really want to go with people who have the core of the market, and you can work with them and hope that they won't do anything to the tile application or to the location system. You just hope it will stay there. But unless you build on it with them, you very quickly going to end up in a really expensive cul-de-sac. And I just don't think we should be doing that.
Brendan Dunphy has just made I think a very important point in the chat. He says, it's all very well saying that the tech giants, Apple and Google, know best how to write these apps, but there's an issue of national sovereignty in, for example, France. The French Digital Affairs Minister, Cédric O, has stated via Reuters that French control of health policy is a sovereign prerogative that shouldn't be handed over to private companies, certainly not American private companies. Maybe some of these issues will have to, maybe some of these long-standing sentiments will have to be set aside if we really are going to get a solution that works internationally.
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. If you remember Minitel and what Dean mentioned, Prestel, which I remember very warmly, you know, we all like the idea of our countries doing something amazing. But, you know, UK has amazing stuff. You know, we're very strong in cheap technology. We're really strong in a number of areas. But we don't really have to be strong in everything because it's impossible. And the French nerds, from my experience, always think that they're the smartest nerds in the room. But, you know, I would hope that our nerds will be smarter to accept in which place we are better and play together. Because unfortunately, that decision was made 20 years ago. You know, if we wanted to stay in a mobile phone game, and you, David, know better than anybody else that we tried, at least with the operating system game, we would have. But you can't do that. You know, scale is scale. So it's just delusion. I call it Minitel delusion.
And also the handset industry now, you've got the operating systems coming from the US. You've got the actual phones, made mostly in China and South Korea with Taiwanese chips. Yeah, and in particular, Huawei is now the second or third largest handset manufacturer with its own version of Android because it can't use the Google version. So there's going to be some proportion of people who have a complete Huawei stack, some who have an complete Apple stack, and some who have Google plus Samsung. So trying to get all of those three aligned is going to be an interesting exercise, whatever you want to do.
Steve, Dan, you raised a point earlier about battery technology as well. I don't know if there's something more you want to share with the group about that, if you've got a mic handy.
Yes,
Steve.
David. Yes, David. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that the trial in the Isle of Wight has flagged up that battery stuff is an issue. It's not so much of an issue on the newer phones, but on the older phones, which most people have, it is going to be an issue. So, you know, and again, that we're talking here amongst a sort of a very group of knowledgeable people, trying to get over these concerns to the ban in the street, as it were, is going to be incredibly difficult. I don't see how it's going to be done, especially if you don't actually accept working with Apple and Google. That is the only way to go.
I do suspect that working with Apple and Google will produce better battery life, almost certainly, because they can take advantage of operating system knowledge to do that.
Exactly, David. But also working with Apple and Google, you know, that sort of most people do trust them, or they trust them in a sort of neutral way, because nobody realizes what they've signed away with the Apple agreements or the Google agreements. They just go along with it because it's providing them with something that they need, and that's going to be the reason that we should go with that. And it has to be a global system.
So in a minute, I'm going to split this session up into 8 different breakout groups. It's all going to happen randomly. So whoever you're with, 4, 5, or 6 other people, I'm going to encourage you to briefly introduce yourselves and then answer a couple of questions which I'll share with you in a minute. We haven't said so much about the future yet in this discussion. We've talked about the present, which is good, but maybe we can also look a little bit further into the future. Sometimes it's said if you want to look at the future, you should look at South Korea. What did happen in South Korea, Eva mentioned it briefly. There was one person who managed to infect 13 others in the course of a single night visiting 5 other nightclubs. So South Korea was doing very well in controlling local infections. There were several days in which there were no local infections. All the new infections were people coming from airplanes from abroad. So they relaxed a bit and said nightclubs can open up, and then it's still a problem. And so I think the advice now in Korea is no longer to let these nightclubs open. So that's one thing we might discuss. If I can share my screen again, let's see if this works. So I'm going to give you 20 minutes and then I'll call everybody back. And you can discuss anything you like. A chance for you to reflect on what has been said and what hasn't been said. But I hope that each group will be able to report back a statement or assertion that the discussion needs to hear, something possibly that hasn't been emphasized enough, or which wasn't discussed before, and ideally bring back a question as well, which is a topic that you and your group feel is important, but you don't know what the answer is, or you're not sufficiently sure what the answer is. So I'm going to press my breakout groups button in a minute. It's an experiment. We'll see how it works. If it works well, we might do it in more London Futurists meetings in a minute. And for each group, keep an eye on the time. I think the time will be showing. I'm going to call you back after 20 minutes. It'll go quickly, and then be prepared for one person at the end to report back on what statement or assertion and also what question the wider discussion needs. So that's what we're going to do next. Let me get my mouse in the right place again, and let's press the breakout rooms. Create rooms. Sorry that didn't work as smoothly as I'd hoped in several cases. A few learnings for me there. I thought that 5 per group would be good. It turns out that several people had stopped watching and didn't know how to accept the breakout group invites, so some of the groups ended up rather small. And others had a vibrant discussion from what I could see. I'll be interested to hear feedback. So I think there are about 6 groups or 7 groups that had a good discussion. Anybody want to come and share what the conclusions were?
I'm happy to start, if you don't mind.
Katja, please go ahead.
Yeah, lovely to see you, by the way, guys. So we were discussing a couple of things, including transparency, purpose of the app, threshold for privacy-worried end users, etc. And we came up with the statement assertion, which is around whether the app will be a leading actor or a supporting cast member. So a very important question about also moving forward about what the purpose of the app itself will be, for whom, and I mean, depending on which country, because I'm mostly listening to German, the German side, although I live here in the UK, and there the communication is very different to the one here. And then the question that we wanted to lead with is how can we make the infrastructure clear to the public so that it can then shape, let's say, we called it an informed consent to hold either the government and the makers accountable or request certain development directions, including especially privacy.
Right. So how can the infrastructure be made clearer to the public so that the public is less confused, less frightened unnecessarily by misinformation, and so there can be informed consent? Because the governments can take difficult decisions when the electorate, citizens feel that they have been consulted and they understand. Generally, Katja, how is the comparison between what's happening in Germany and what's happening in Britain? Have you a simple insight to share on that?
Well, I'm glad I speak at least 3 languages to listen to different communications. And in Germany, we've got other members I've seen from Germany. The communication is at least very, very transparent, as clear and transparent as possible. And then we also have a lot of people who are actually scientists from the virology field. So I feel very well informed. But I'm not living in a country where the information that kind of information is used, or even data, I don't know, like used in a way that I trust the government to have made the right decision. So, you know, like if you would have a lot more data, you would make very different decisions than have been made in this country. And that's a bit controversial for me to live in one country and get the information.
Well, being able to learn relevant information from other countries is a hard skill, because obviously countries are different and practices can't simply transform across, but there may still be ways to learn.
Yeah, so
let's move to...
an app will be very interesting if we were not very thorough with data gathering, like testing previously. Then maybe we could now catch up with managing the trajectory of the virus spread. Let's
move to Weil. Sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. If you come off mute.
That was very good. Yes, Weil. Thanks very much. We were really discussing the need for regulation. Should there be regulation around app development? My concern was that may mean that a framework is in place that doesn't allow you to develop an app in the way you want to develop it. However, if you look at the example of, say, cannabis and pharmaceuticals, certain countries have taken that and used it medicinally, other countries aren't. People have the option to look at that one way or the other. We didn't necessarily come to a conclusion. We were very much divided on that. My background is journalism. There was a point made that perhaps journalism should have been developed within such a framework of regulation. I don't feel that works necessarily for journalism. Obviously, with pharmaceuticals, it does seem to work, though things do get through the cracks, as it were. So yeah, we didn't decide that one way or the other was necessarily better.
So just as the subject of privacy and security and trust, they're all complex and there isn't a simple answer that can work. Regulation probably fits in that same bucket. It is a complex topic and there are benefits to the right regulation, but it's a tough subject and maybe it needs more attention. Next group, who wants to go next? Don't all rush at once.
I'll go.
Karen, please.
I was with John Baines and Bruce Lloyd. We had a lovely chat. But the main points for us that came up, there was the technology that is being looked at for the app is just going for too complicated, and that there's possibly a more simple solution, that they're getting overcomplicated with tech, and that there could be a simplified less cost option. There was then a bit of a discussion about the temperature, and that people are focusing a lot on taking temperature when people come back into the country or when they cross a border, but quite often people are already infectious before their temperature rises. So how accurate and useful is that? And then just the focus on the most vulnerable, that the people that are least likely to have the technology are probably the people that are most at risk, and how that could be discussed. And then towards the end, we were just sharing a little bit about our different industry sectors. And for me, from the entertainment industry, it's been very interesting to hear that we're very much on the flip side, because we can't do anything until audiences can go places where social distancing means enough people are in a single location to make a production break even for a particular night. So it is really interesting to see how the general public are going to be released and how they'll adopt the new normal, because until we know how many bums on seats we can have in a venue, it's going to be very hard to restart the industry.
Looking for simpler solutions. A phrase that we used to have in the mobile industry was, it is simple to make something complex. It is complicated to make something simple. I think that's
Yes.
Meyer's law.
That came up.
Einstein also said we should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. I actually think the Google and Apple system is pretty simple. It doesn't have location-based systems. It just has Bluetooth conversations, and they change the IDs on a regular basis. But how that works can be communicated and explained fairly straightforwardly. But no, I share these views. Many thanks. Who wants to go next?
I guess I could go next.
Suki, please go ahead. Yes.
Okay, so I was in a group with Terence, Andrew, and Hamed. Excuse me if I said your name. Is it Hamed or Hamed? But anyways, I digress. Sorry. I'm begrudgingly doing this, Andrew. But so we have a number of points. We of course couldn't decide on one because we think this is way too big for just one. But first and foremost is, why do you need an app? and first of all, looking at the international aspect of the app, like how is this passport going to work? Because if you go to another country and they have a different system, you have to download that app. Are those two apps going to be able to speak to each other? So for people that do travel a lot, this is just, yeah. Who worries about your battery in your own country when you're going to lots of other countries and it's all draining your battery? I personally think the battery issue just needs to not be discussed right now, because why do we even need the app that's not going to be able to tell you the level of infection? So, and as it was just pointed out in the last discussion group, you have somebody who's asymptomatic and they're already coming in, their temperature hasn't risen, but they're asymptomatic. I made a point in the main chat room that if somebody is asymptomatic, they don't have the app downloaded, and they meet with somebody who is not got coronavirus, has the app, there's no tracing ability there. So it completely negates the idea of having an app. Also, trust is the big one, because behind this, we know that the team that's building it, they don't have the expertise to deploy. Then they're actually outsourcing that sort of talent, and the people that are coming in don't have the best backgrounds. They're slightly nefarious. And so where does that information end up? When you have given it away to the government, it doesn't actually end with the government. Also, there was another point that Terence made that I begrudgingly, because I am the spokesperson, I didn't write it down, and I can't find it. So that's just going to have to be it for now. We just had too much of a robust discussion to actually stick to the main point.
I'm very ambitious getting you to report back in just 2 minutes. In terms of why need an app, I think it's clear the app will not solve all problems, but it might be incrementally useful to have that extra information. I think that's the argument, that it's not a silver bullet, but it will take us a little bit further along the road of knowing when we might have been close to somebody who was infected.
I will add in that one point of the biggest misnomer of technology in the last 15, 20 years, but especially in the last 5 years, is, tech will save us. And whenever there's an issue that arises in any sector, everybody says, let's build an app. and everybody rushes to think the app is going to be it. And that's the biggest issue, because your general everyday layperson is thinking that this app is going to be it, because they'll now know whether that person they're standing 6 feet from is, oh my gosh, that person has coronavirus. That's going to save my life. I can't go here again. Can't go in that shop.
Right.
And
No, so we need more than just apps. We need human values and human decisions, and the apps are a tool when we know what we want to do. Which group is next? Who would like to speak? It hasn't spoken yet. PJ says it used to be let's build a database, indeed. Which groups haven't had a chance to report back? Steve.
Hi, David. Yeah, it's a sort of, I was in a group with Alan and Edward and Therese, and we had a very good chat and talk about this sort of thing. Not enough time to go through all the things. The sort of highlights, I think, that what we were discussing was really it's a problem about privacy is the main thing, and also how you. This app has to work internationally. It can't be sort of pocketed into individual countries. It has to work on a sort of global basis. And really the only companies that are going to be able to help pull this together are going to be Google and Apple. And privacy-wise, most people have signed away a lot of their rights already to Google and Apple. So I think that's just going to be, if somebody wants to use this app, then they're going to have to go that way. Then we got into the actually discussing about actually how useful is the app going to be? I think that it's going to require an awful lot more than 18,000 people to actually sort of follow up on all these things, because it's the sort of it's open for misuse and hacking. And people just making general mischief for other people. I think it's going to be, as it's set out at the moment, it's going to be very difficult to use. And can we actually sort of trust the people that are using it to use it properly? So I think those are the sort of main things that came out of what we were talking about.
Would you make it a criminal offence for somebody to attach their phone to their dog and to mislead the system? Or would you just say that's boys being boys?
Well, I think they're actually talking about actually sort of putting a minimum of £1,000 fine on sort of misuse of the app, aren't they, for a starter? But it's going to be how easy is it going to be to police this? And really, is this app going to be useful, or is the app just for window dressing and to get somebody to think that, or get people in general to think that they're being looked after, and it's all going to be the way that we can open up the country and open up the world again? I think that might be part of it. Might be just a lot of it 50% window dressing, I think.
Right. Tom Seabury in chat makes the point, in a millennium hence, or maybe even a decade hence, the idea of ignoring human tracing in favor of an app solution will be laughable. I don't think that is the proposal, that it'll just be the app. The proposal is, as you say, Steve, there'll be a large number of people needed as well to make sense of the data, at least for the foreseeable future.
Correct. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, if you could make something that actually works properly and is fit for purpose, I think it's a great idea, and I think most people would actually sort of sign up to that. But we're a long way from that at the moment.
So there's at least one other group still to speak. Is that Max or Mary or somebody else from that group to speak up? Mary.
I think Max is meant to be reporting.
So Mary is passing the baton to you, Max.
Yeah. Where are you, Max?
He's here.
Thanks.
Oh, there you are. I can see you.
Okay. My statement that I discussed with Mary is that contact tracing is an inferior measure. Hello?
Yeah, we're listening. Yeah.
Sorry, my screen just froze. So you caught all of that?
Yes.
Yeah. To designing and mass producing a lightweight hazmat suit. When the situation is life or death, no measure is too extreme. So my question would be, what are your disagreements with that? Is it not feasible? Is it too resource intensive? Or do you think that's too demeaning to people and dehumanizing, that now they're just seen as vehicles for the virus and they can't experience the world directly?
So say that again. What are our disagreements with which single statement?
with the idea of designing and mass producing a lightweight hazmat suit. So instead of doing this contact tracing, we just ensure by design that people can't become infected.
Right, so this is an alternative to a vaccine. It's not a vaccine that goes inside our blood. It's a kind of a vaccine that goes outside our body, hazmat suits.
Yeah, until the vaccine is issued.
And then we don't need to bother with apps. Right, well, that's an interesting proposal for the group. Anything else that the group wants to put on the table for a takeaway? Mary, Max?
I think that's all from me.
And I said it needs to be washable. I'm fed up of all this single-use PPE nonsense.
Right.
I'll just very quickly say that I'm surprised we're not giving a similar level of attention to the many other diseases and illnesses. We've all pounced on this one. So, yeah, I think that's odd.
Right. So obviously this is the disease that's getting the most attention just now, but there are many other diseases which, until recently at least, were killing more. And it depends how you look at it. If you take aging as a disease, then it's still killing more people than the COVID-19. But maybe we will have a spreading of concern. We'll start off with this concern, and then gradually there'll be a spreading out into addressing other infectious and then other chronic issues as well.
That we're busy chasing something for which we've got no solution. We'd say, and it's all post hoc anyhow.
So you think there's no solution, Terry?
It's not preventative because the measurement is taken of a meeting you've had with somebody who is infected, shall we say. And then having known that, what can you do about it? There's no cure at present. So big news. I've just been near someone who's got a poison in the air around me and I can't do anything about it. Way! That's really useful stuff to know.
Well, it's good that you know it, because if you didn't know that, then you might be poisoning others. But if you do know it, then you're restricting the poison. And you want other people not to poison you if they know they're infected.
Well, it depends whether they know that or not.
Right. Well, that's hence the app. Is there another group that hasn't spoken yet? Or have we been through everybody? In that case... Haven't. So, okay, who is that? Susan. Yes, please, Susan. What would you like to share?
Well, I was in the group with Michael, William, and Emilia. And we had a similar conversation to that with like Suki's group had. And I think like I can say that in general, we all are kind of not very enthusiastic about this application thing as a solution. We were discussing about privacy, security, and a little and if the future as well. And well, it's hackers are a big concern with all the data that can be around, and yes, we are not very enthusiastic about this solution.
So before you were more enthusiastic, there's a better communications job needs to be made by the sounds of it. So neither the people on this call nor the government spokespeople as a whole have managed to convince you yet that this is something you want to get involved with.
No. I think, and the other people who were in the group agreed, is like this kind of application may lead to future problems concerning privacy, security, and maybe things like what is happening in China, then having social, what is what they have? Social
credit.
Yes. So, and it's going to become something normal, and it's not nice.
So again, with my mobile development hat on, the point you made is very important, which is you have to think about the deployment, you have to think about the communication, you have to think about hand-holding your users so that your users understand what's going on. Now, the NHSX people might say in their defense that they're doing the right thing. They're trialing this in a small area, the Isle of Wight, which is reasonably self-contained with less travel. And so they're communicating with the people on the Isle of Wight, they might say, and that's a chance to sort out some of the issues beforehand. But it's too early to say. It's too early to say.
Another thing that we were saying is what Suki was saying as well about there are a lot of people traveling, like who are going to travel again, and what happens with all the applications, different applications. Do you have to download all of them? Are they going to be compatible? How is this going to work? It doesn't make sense to me.
So I think that's an argument for having a single app rather than having a multiple app, if possible, or at least making it very straightforward for people to accept and install. We've used 90 minutes. I'd like to give our three panelists a chance to make some final comments on anything they've heard from that set of summaries. And also what you think, panelists, we should probably focus on in future events. So perhaps we go in reverse order. Maybe Bruce, what's your comments on what you have heard?
A couple of things, really. One is that I think we need to spend more time focusing on the disadvantaged groups and the people who are particularly vulnerable and the people who are in the ethnic minorities that are seem to be particularly affected by this. And there seems to be a tendency to try to produce a solution that covers all the issues. And I think that by the time that solution, even if it worked, got into widespread application, it would be months down the road before it was producing any really useful results. So I do think that we need to get quite a bit of attention focused on what we can do to address the immediate issues of trying to deal with hotspots and difficulties in that area.
Right. Step-by-step approach, which has always been the route of good app development, but with a vision as to where we're going.
But I think that the issue of a step-by-step approach within the apps that are under consideration, it's going to be months before they are used in any widespread, effective way, even if they work and even if we solve all the problems in the meantime. But which we can't have the whole country shut down until that happens. So we need to get on with dealing with the immediate issues that we've got, so that it can be much more, we can feel much more confident that we've got it under at least some control, enough control to get a little bit back to normal.
Right. I'm not sure I entirely agree things will inevitably take months. I remember what Doug Pipchick said earlier, that they managed to put a system in place in their large international corporation fairly quickly. Doug's no longer with us.
That's a very different issue to getting the general population and the vulnerable groups.
The vulnerable groups, yeah.
Signed into it all.
I think that's a good point. Thanks. Dean, final comments from you?
I'm not sure I've come out of this with more answers than I started with. I think that the thing which comes out of, first of all, is that whatever app we choose or whatever combination of technical tracking and tracing as automated and manual we come out with over the next month, it's simply the first step. And there's clearly going to be a whole host of iterations. And we have to hope that they're as best as we can get to start with. But I strongly don't expect them to look anything like this in a year's time. And so even if we have privacy concerns, my suspicion is that either we're going to start with absolutely privacy safe and then it's going to get worse, or we're going to start with absolutely privacy invasive and it's going to get better. And we'll probably end up meeting somewhere in the middle either way.
And what's your views on hazmat suits, Dean?
Hazmat suits or death, what's it going to be? I see from Max. That's a completely false binary. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be wearing a hazmat suit anytime soon. I do wear a mask in appropriate places where I think there's a risk of the transmission one way or another. But I think there's going to be have to be a certain amount of moderation in all of this and acceptance of a certain modicum of risk, as we all do in any aspect of life. And I think it's looking at relative risk and what is acceptable either as a society or as an individual, and how you manage that, or whether that's a privacy or a safety level.
I don't mind coming out of the event with fewer answers than expected, but I hope at least there may be key questions in people's minds more than before. But even if we're all still confused, we might be confused in a more effective way, so that over the next few days, when we read news articles or other conversations, we will be able to learn more quickly the key points.
Sounds good. Enlightening confusion. I think
enlightening confusion. Eva, right. Final comments from you?
Great. Okay, what a fabulous discussion. I certainly learned a lot, and it's really interesting how many comments about the privacy and the practicalities. Okay, my takeaway from it is that, this is my third lockdown. I was through the lockdown in Poland during Chernobyl, and also another lockdown before, during martial law. And the one thing I learned is that you absolutely cannot trust any government, because they're on it just for themselves. You will never get guidance from a government, because they're just interested in surviving as a power. So you always have to have, ladder full of stuff for at least a month, gas mask and friendly neighbors. And that will take you a long way in any catastrophe. But I think in the current catastrophe, I think the government really, really needs to get a bit more realistic and start talking to people, not make decisions at some, sage committee with dodgy characters on it, but open up and have everybody a say about the privacy, because we are all different, as Annette and many people made the point, different cultures, different points of time. Where we are today, I think people would rather not trust this particular government, and they have to know it. And the second point I took from today is professionals. Talk to people who are app developers and app marketers. Don't go around telling people download it because it's your duty, as Matt Hancock said, because that's just pathetic. Nobody's going to do that if it's a pile of poo. So they have to try to find a communication to people and value proposition that we will be interested in. International movement, international app, international robust tech stack, and then you have a chance. And good luck with that.
Thanks to everybody. I'll try and answer the point that Tom has just raised. He says he's still seeking clarity on the exact purpose on the app. And as we've discussed, there are quite a few possible purposes. But what I'm looking for, and which the reason I might well install and use the app from Google and Apple, is a very simple thing that it does. It will let me know if I have been close to somebody within the last week or so that has subsequently reported themselves as being infectious. And that will be useful additional information for me. And it will give me a little bit more information, and then it might lead me to quarantining myself if necessary, and being sure that I don't pass on my possible infection to others who are even more vulnerable than me. So that's a reasonably well-defined task. It's not going to do all the other stuff too, and it's important that we have a longer and more careful discussion about these requirements. Yes, as Dean says, it's not of course an app, but an app that you based on these particular APIs and so on. Anybody else got a burning point they'd like to raise before I shut down the system? We're already 10 minutes late, for which I apologize. Yeah.
Thank you for doing these over and over. I don't think that, at least in this country, I have thorough enough real conversations about any of these points. So, I think there's a lack in thinking and talking about what we're thinking and talking about. So thank you again for organizing.
Well, we're learning how to do the conversations better, and I'm interested to know if the breakout, if you'd like in due course, other breakout events. What I'm thinking of doing is, after the normal crowdcast sessions in London Futurists, which tend to go on for an hour and a half with panels, I might invite people who want a smaller subject to come back into a Zoom meeting to continue discussing it in the way that we used to do in the pub. So although it wasn't perfect, the breakout discussions, I think it was still broadly useful. So thanks to all of you for staying with it. Special thanks to Bruce Lloyd, Dean Bubley and Eva Pascoe for setting the scene and for answering well throughout. And thanks to everybody who facilitated the breakout rooms in any way.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much to everybody. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.